We're going to talk about how to collect and package evidence from a crime scene. One of the most important things when collecting and packaging evidence is to maintain what's called a chain of custody. A chain of custody is a written record of all people who've had possession of an item of evidence, beginning at the time of collection. So the process for maintaining a chain of custody is that the evidence container must be marked for identification. So whatever container you're putting all of your evidence in would be marked with the location of the crime scene, the case file number, and then the collector. So whoever the crime scene investigator is that's investigating the case, his name would go on there as well. Once all the evidence is collected and packaged properly inside the container, the evidence container is sealed, and the collector's initials are written on the seal to show if it's been broken or not. If the evidence is turned over to another person, that transfer must be recorded. So there's like a chain of custody paper that goes along with, or is usually directly on the box of evidence. And every time it transfers over, so from the crime scene investigator to the evidence locker at the police compound, if anybody in the crime lab asks for the evidence to be brought up to them to analyze, anytime the evidence changes hands, it's recorded every single time in the chain of custody. The purpose of this is to make sure that all evidence is accounted for from the time you collect it indefinitely. If it can't be accounted for, if there's a lapse in time, or you can tell that the box has been opened and nothing has been recorded on the chain of custody, then you can assume that the evidence has been tampered with, and all the evidence in that container would be considered thrown out of court, meaning that they wouldn't be allowed to go into court at all because they wouldn't know if it had been tampered with or not. So it's super important to make sure that you always maintain a correct chain of custody. When collecting and packaging evidence, each item that you collect is placed in a separate container, it's sealed, and it's labeled properly. So here's some examples of some evidence that's been properly collected. You can see that every tiny piece of evidence, no matter how small, gets put usually in a primary container, pill bottles, vials, manila envelopes, plastic bags, and then usually a secondary container. It's usually paper bags or plastic bags, depending. Sometimes trace evidence they'll put into a very small piece of paper and do what's called the druggist fold, where they fold the paper up in a specific way to make sure that the evidence stays in the paper, and then the paper with the evidence in it gets put into a secondary container like a plastic bag. Most fragile items of evidence get collected and packaged first, so if there's anything at your crime scene that's fragile or that you thought could potentially be ruined at any point in time when you're collecting other evidence, that would be what you would want to collect first. A lot of times they'll do weapons and things like that first, just to make sure that there's no misfires or anything like that. There are different types of packaging techniques depending upon the actual evidence. So there's certain evidence that requires like special or specific collection techniques. One of the ones we want to make sure we take a look at first is the body. Like if you have a dead body, that's always property of the medical examiner or the coroner, so you can't do anything, you can't touch it, you can't search it, you can't do anything. Everything on the body belongs to the coroner, so you won't want to do anything with that. Some other considerations to take a look at is any evidence that's wet, right? It's a bloody t-shirt that's wet, or any, like a mop that's been used that's wet. Anything that's wet must be dried before packaging. If they have to collect it and take it back to the crime lab in order to dry it out, they'll put it in a paper bag because paper bags are breathable and they won't cause anything to mold. They'll never put anything that's wet into plastic bags because it could potentially mold before they get to it. And if anything gets mold on it, it's considered contaminated and wouldn't be able to be used. But wet items, they'll mark as wet, they'll put them in a paper bag, and they'll take them back to the lab, and then they'll dry them out before they're actually repackaged and put into the evidence box. Any biological items, blood, saliva, semen, anything like that would be dried out when they get back to the lab and then kept in the freezer, because biological items decompose very quickly. They'll last much longer in the freezer. So when they're put in the freezer, they can last 6 months to a year, however long it takes them to get to it to actually test it. Whereas if they're left just in its regular container and air temperature, it may only last a couple of weeks before it decomposes. Clothing with trace, so that would be like a t-shirt with hair, fibers, or anything like that, would be packaged carefully to avoid disruption. So they'll try to fold it in a way that the fibers would stay in an exact location, or they would do a tape lift of the fiber and then put it in. Kind of depends on what it looks like. Firearms are put inside a fixed wooden container. So they have like specific firearms boxes. They always unload all the weapons at the crime scene, and then they would put them in the fixed wooden box so that there's no misfires that happen. And then arson evidence, which is fire evidence, they would put it in an airtight sealed container so that any of the fumes that are there, they could analyze at a later date. So those are just some of the things to take into consideration for certain types of evidence. The last thing that they want to make sure and do is collect control samples from the victim, from the scene. A control is any sample with a known origin. So when you're collecting controls, you know where they came from. So if you're collecting a control from the victim, right, if you collect DNA from the victim or fingerprints from the victim, you know who they belong to. Same thing for the suspects. If you collect controls from your suspects, you know who they come from. You can collect controls from the crime scene itself, like if they have a dog or if they have specific fibers on a couch, you can collect control samples so that you can analyze those. Here are some common control samples that they usually take if they can. They'll usually take fingerprints, DNA, hair, and blood, especially if they need to find a match to anything from the crime scene. So here's an example of how it would work. If they found blood at a crime scene, the unknown is the blood at the crime scene. The controls would be any blood they take from the victim and the suspects, and they're trying to match it back to what's at the scene to see if it matches the victim or any of the suspects. So all of your items placed in individual separate containers and always labeled properly. Fragile items collected first. Make sure to take any considerations for special packaging techniques, and then to make sure that you collect all your control samples. Here are some examples of evidence tags to use. This would be like a chain of custody tag. So notice there's a case. There's a case number right here. So they would put the case number, the date, and this is a description of anything that goes into the box. So like a list of evidence in the box. And then here's your received from, received by, time and date for everybody who is in contact with the box at any time. And then this is an individual evidence tag. Every single thing that's packaged would get its own individual tag. The time and date that they're working with, a description of the evidence that's being collected, where it was removed from inside the crime scene, the address of the crime scene, and then your received by person is usually either the person who's in charge of your chain of custody box or whoever receives it at the crime lab. And then once you've collected and packaged everything and you've got everything into your evidence box and it's been submitted properly, your chain of custody has been kept, you submit all the evidence to the crime lab for analysis. Anything that has been collected and packaged can be sent to the crime lab. The crime scene investigators at the crime scene are allowed to ask for specific tests. So like if they have a specific thing, we'd like a DNA profile ran specifically on this piece of evidence, or we want a blood sample from this, or so on and so forth, they can. However, the forensic analysts at the crime lab aren't limited to those. So they can continue to do those types of testing. They can do additional testing based on what they see fit to try to figure out any information they can from any of the evidence. Once the crime scene investigators have kind of put all the evidence to the crime lab, other than having to potentially testify in court for any evidence that they've collected, they've kind of finished up their portion of their job. Their job is to process kind of from start to finish, and they're done. And now the forensic scientist's job will be to actually analyze all the evidence, and then the detective's job will be to kind of run down all the leads in the case, and then potentially any of them would have to testify in court as to their findings if needed.